You wake up to the sound of boots echoing through cobbled streets. June 9, 1944, 2 days after the Normandy landings. Liberation is close, close enough to taste, but not close enough to save you. The town had just exhaled, breathing in the faint scent of freedom after local resistance fighters staged a daring attack on the German garrison. Dozens of German soldiers were killed. The Maquisards, those elusive shadows of the French resistance, melted back into the hills. And now the SS Panzer Division Das Reich is here to collect the debt. The same unit that burned Ukrainian villages to ash, the same men who lined ditches in the east with bodies, trained not just to fight, but to punish, hardened by Himmler's code of reprisal, conditioned to equate civilian life with military leverage. They do not arrive like an army. They descend like a plague. Heinrich Lammerding is in command, a name you'll never forget, not because you knew him, but because your brother did, your father did, your cousin, because they were chosen. 99 men, arbitrarily selected from the population, workers, fathers, students, retirees. Some hadn't touched a weapon in their lives. Others had sons too young to speak. All marched into the center of Tulle. And there in the town squares, on lampposts and balconies, they were hanged, one by one, in silence. No trial, no priest, just rope, just gravity, just Lammerding's lesson in obedience, spelled out in the dead. It wasn't execution, it was performance. The SS didn't shoot them quickly in a courtyard. They strung them up publicly in pairs, in rows across the town. The message was calculated. We know your faces. We control your streets. And if you ever raise your hand again, we will answer with 10 of our own. You watched mothers faint, wives scream, children vomit. And then the SS made the survivors cut the bodies down. No time for burial rites. No mercy. But Tulle was not the only wound that week. 2 days later, in Oradour-sur-Glane, the same division would herd hundreds into a church and barns and set them ablaze. 642 men, women, and children, burned, shot, erased, all for revenge, for a resistance that dared to believe France could still stand. Years later, the names of those 99 men in Tulle are etched into stone. Their memories survive. Their families endure. But the questions never left. Why Tulle? Why them? And where was justice? After the war, hope for accountability flickered. The survivors spoke. The widows wrote petitions. Testimonies were gathered. Lammerding was tried in absentia by a French court in 1953 and sentenced to death. But he was never extradited. He lived in West Germany, in comfort. Protected by Bonn, shielded by the Cold War's cynical math, better to keep NATO stable than to reopen old wounds. He died in 1971, peacefully, in his bed. Never saw a cell, never answered to a judge, never heard the names of the men he condemned. France protested, survivors protested, but geopolitics had already written a different story. The men of Das Reich, some of them slipped through post-war justice like smoke, others melted back into German society, taking civil jobs, changing names. A few decades later were identified, questioned, briefly detained. But justice delayed is justice diluted, and for Tulle the reckoning felt incomplete. Still, revenge in its own bitter way had taken root long before the gavel ever came down. The French resistance didn't wait for trials. After the massacre, the Maquis hunted collaborators and German stragglers with ruthless efficiency. Executions in the forests, assassinations in alleys, summary justice in basements and barns. Some of it targeted, some of it chaotic, but none of it forgotten. The war had turned men into weapons. The occupation had taught them that mercy was a luxury, and now, with the balance shifting, they answered atrocity with retribution. Right or wrong? That question haunted post-war France for years. The pain didn't end in 1944. Tulle lost not just 99 men, but their futures. Their children grew up fatherless, their families fractured, their town once vibrant wore grief like a second skin. And grief, when left to rot, becomes something else. For a long time, Tulle stayed quiet. The wounds were too raw, the fear too fresh. Talking about it reopened what people had spent years trying to stitch closed, so they buried it. But memory, like justice, doesn't stay buried. By the 1980s, new generations demanded more than silence. They built a museum, the Centre de la Mémoire. They installed plaques, organized marches, filmed interviews with the aging survivors. Schools began taking students to the hanging sites, now preserved with plaques and photographs. The memory of Tulle shifted from private mourning to public history, and with it came a broader reckoning. What does justice look like when no one pays? What does healing mean when the guilty die free? How do you teach a child that 99 of their ancestors died in one day, not in battle, but by decree? These questions still echo through Tulle's streets. In Germany, too, something changed. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, German officials began to acknowledge complicity more openly. Joint commemorations were held, some towns issued apologies, memorials were erected with both French and German involvement. It was too late for trials, but not too late for truth. And truth, no matter how delayed, is still a weapon against erasure. Tulle's story is not just French. It sits universal. It's about what happens when the rules collapse, when ideology replaces empathy, when soldiers are trained to see civilians not as humans but as leverage. It's about what happens when victory is measured not in battles won, but in punishments delivered. And it's about how the scars of war outlast every bullet, every rope, every fire. They live in memory. They live in stone. They live in the words of those who refuse to forget. So when you stand in Tulle and you read the names, each etched into the wall like a whisper from the past, you're not just remembering the dead. You are answering the question they were never allowed to ask. Why me? And the answer is not justice. It's Stutz, not revenge. It's just remembrance. Because remembrance is the last weapon we have against forgetting. And forgetting is how it happens again. You didn't need to see the bodies to feel the death settle into the town. Tulle wasn't just wounded. It was altered, permanently, not by bombs, not by gunfire, but by the silence that came afterward, an oppressive quiet that gripped homes, classrooms, churches. Grief became the ambient air. The massacre fractured more than families. It fractured time. In Tulle, June 9th, 1944 became a dividing line. There was life before that date, and everything that followed was simply aftermath. But the trauma didn't stay confined to widows or children. It seeped into every social layer: shopkeepers who had watched helplessly from their windows, priests forced to deliver last rites to men still dangling, teachers whose pupils now sat in class with empty eyes. There were no instructions for how to rebuild a town that had just watched its men die on hooks. The psychological contagion. Trauma became a generational inheritance. Children of the hanged grew up in a cloud of second-hand mourning. Some learned the details slowly, overheard through cracked doors, whispered through tears at kitchen tables. Others were shielded entirely, growing up with an inexplicable ache they couldn't name. Some sons of the dead went to war in Indochina and Algeria, carrying their father's ghost into a different kind of battlefield. Some daughters never married. Others refused to speak of June altogether, believing that to move forward, one had to shut the door on memory. But history is not a door you can close. And grief doesn't expire with the passing of years. It calcifies. It embeds itself in town rituals, in the way people cross streets to avoid the square, in how they speak to soldiers, in how they treat strangers. Tulle didn't just remember. It adapted to survival by developing cultural trauma responses that historians wouldn't name until decades later. The moral tension within the resistance. To understand the scale of the reprisals, you also have to look inside the resistance. Their ambush on June 7th was tactically sound. They captured German soldiers, disrupted enemy communications, and proved that the Maquis could strike deep within occupied towns. But it raised questions that still linger. Were the resistance fighters aware of the consequences that would follow? Did they anticipate that German retaliation would fall not on them, but on the civilian population? Some say yes, and argue that the resistance accepted the risk as part of their ethical burden. Others say no, that they underestimated the savagery of the SS, or hoped their victory would inspire others to rise. But the Germans didn't play by moral rules. They played by a doctrine of calculated terror. That puts the resistance in an uncomfortable historical light. Warriors against tyranny, yes, but also reluctant catalysts of suffering. Not because they desired it, but because under occupation, even heroism has a cost. The role of the Church. Another quiet actor in the Tulle tragedy, the Church. Priests pleaded with SS commanders. They begged for mercy, offered to negotiate, even to trade themselves. But Lammerding wasn't there for negotiation. He was there to demonstrate. Still, the clergy sep's role afterward was vital. They administered sacraments to the dead, comforted the shattered, and later helped preserve testimony. Sermons became coded acts of resistance, stories of sacrifice and resurrection, turned into metaphors for a town trying to climb out of its own grave. Some local priests were resistance collaborators. Others were too afraid. But every church bell that rang after June 9th told differently. It carried weight, guilt, fury, and a quiet promise: this will not be forgotten. The women left behind. Too often in war, history names the dead and forgets the survivors. But the women of Tulle, the mothers, wives, sisters, daughters, were left to rebuild a town without its men. They took over shops. They raised children alone. They ran farms, managed paperwork, nursed the sick, buried the bones. Some formed informal support networks, early models of what we'd now call trauma recovery circles. Others sank into silence. Some became politically active, joining post-war campaigns for reparations and recognition. But many had to fight for their voices to be heard, because post-war France celebrated resistance heroes, not the women who held communities together after those heroes were buried. It took decades for their resilience to be acknowledged as equally vital. Collaborators in the shadows. Another uncomfortable truth: not everyone in Tulle hated the SS. There were collaborators, informants, opportunists who saw advantage in aligning with power. Some owned shops that catered to German officers. Others provided information, names, addresses, suspicions. In the chaos after the massacre, many of these individuals disappeared. Some were executed by resistance fighters during the Opération Sauvage, the wild purge that swept France before formal trials were established. Others reinvented themselves. They changed their stories. They became patriots after the fact. History has a way of favoring victors, And in Tulle, like everywhere, some survivors rewrote their past to blend in. The children of the occupiers. In the post-war reckoning, few fates were more complicated than that of the children fathered by German soldiers and French women. In Tulle, this became another fracture line. Some of these children were hidden, others were publicly shamed, ostracized, labeled, sometimes even abused for their lineage. Their mothers were called traitors, shaved bald in the town square, paraded through the streets in acts of collective revenge. These acts, too, are part of the story. Because the fury that follows liberation isn't always just. Sometimes it simply finds the nearest target, and the trauma becomes generational, not just for the victims of Nazi violence, but for those caught in the moral gray zones that war always creates. Justice denied, or justice deferred. While the post-war trials did sentence some Nazi officers to death, the man who ordered the Tulle massacre, Lammerding, died a free man. This injustice festered. French courts requested extradition. Germany refused. For years, French activists and survivors petitioned for renewed investigations. Some attempted private prosecutions. All were blocked. Eventually, in a twist of historical irony, the man responsible for killing 99 Frenchmen was buried in a peaceful cemetery in West Germany, a grave that has become the occasional site of protest, graffiti, and bitter memory. The French government never forgot, but they were forced to live with the fact that forgetting had become policy elsewhere. Commemorating the right way. The question of how to remember the Tulle massacre has always been fraught. What kind of memorial do you build for a crime that was never punished? What kind of education do you offer when the full story implicates not just enemies but neighbors? Tulle answered by building its museum not around vengeance, but around memory. Not around accusation, but education. Its monuments are not grandiose. They are somber, reflective, rooted in place. Each June, the town holds a ceremony. Flags are raised, the names are read, students are invited. Survivors, now few and fragile, speak when they can. That's not a reenactment. That's a warning. Because what happened in Tulle did not end in Tulle. It lives in every town where power decides that terror is more effective than truth. Lessons for now. In a world where authoritarianism is again on the rise, where misinformation spreads faster than facts, where civilians are once again pawns in geopolitical games, the story of Tulle matters. Not as a dusty tale of old Europe, but as a signal flare. This is what happens when militaries forget morality. When soldiers are told that civilians are expendable, when revenge is elevated to policy, and when the perpetrators of atrocity find safe harbor in bureaucratic comfort. Tulle reminds us that the difference between justice and silence is not inevitability. It's death's choice. It's vigilance. It's the courage to name evil even when it's inconvenient. And still, it echoes. The bells still ring every June. The list of the 99 is still read. But those aren't just names. They stir questions. Not about how they died, but how we live. Do we recognize the signs of state violence before it's too late? Do we teach our children that silence in the face of injustice is complicity? Do we remember that morality is fragile in the heat of war and must be guarded every day? That's the legacy of Tulle. Not just a town that suffered, but a town that refused to let memory die. Hidden resistance networks. Beyond the armed Maquis groups that executed the garrison raid, there existed tightly knit civilian resistance cells in Tulle. Postmen, teachers, railroad workers, and factory employees who coordinated messaging, smuggled supplies, and provided safe houses. These networks functioned on whispered trust, a lit fuse in civilian society. They processed maps, ration cards, and underground newspapers. When SS reprisals came, some of these networks became casualties themselves, dismantled under suspicion, ruining lives that stood outside the widely told saga of the armed resistance. Economic aftershocks. When the SS executed those 99 men, they didn't destroy just lives, they wiped out breadwinners. Businesses collapsed, shops shuttered, family farms lay fallow. In the months following, the local economy cratered, bakeries closed, the river mills caught dust, and local tradesmen found themselves unable to pay debts. It took years for families to recover or relocate. The town's economic setbacks reverberated generations. Fewer universities attended, increased poverty, and a slower recovery than nearby towns unaffected by reprisal massacres. Silencing under the new regime. In the immediate post-war years, a new political pressure descended upon Tulle. The liberation government demanded unity and reconstruction. Mentioning the massacre was overshadowed by appeals for reconciliation and rebuilding national pride. To speak loudly of Tulle risked being labeled divisive or defeatist. Teachers were reprimanded for broaching the subject in class. Locals, fearful of disrupting unity, avoided speaking in public forums until the later decades of the 20th century. Psychological defense mechanisms of survivors. Survivors employed coping strategies long before psychologists named them. Collective humor became a form of resistance to depression. Women invented black market knitting circles under the pretext of social clubs. Children sang songs that mocked the SS, and the elderly formed commemorative poetry circles. Many carried folk legends of vengeance embedded in regional culture, tales of ghostly rappings at night, invisible arms exacting spectral justice on German officers lurking around the town's edges. These didn't just heal, they sent messages to outsiders that grief would not be domesticated. Rebuilding through cultural acts. One unexpected outlet for the community's recovery was theater. Local playwrights dramatized the events of that week in 1944, staging plays in community centers by 1950. It was raw, limited budgets, no fancy lighting, but residents filled the seats. Young people who had known little of the violence watched scenes reenacted through art. Tulle bridged generations traumatized by silence. These plays, informal at first, became annual features, gradually evolving into professional productions involving French and German actors seeking reconciliation in performance. Transnational historical dialogue. By the 1980s, a series of German towns began twin partnerships with Tulle, accepting delegations that included politicians, students, and clergy. Visits included walking memorial paths, attending ceremonies, and walking out with jars of local cognac as a gesture of peace. Simultaneously, French delegations traveled to Germany to attend trials and speak in base communities about Tulle's story. These cross-border exchanges were quiet diplomacy, less about state-level policy and more about grassroots healing. Tulle's experience became part of broader European efforts to address past violence outside strictly national channels. Comparative analysis, Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Tulle may seem uniquely Western in its story, yet when compared to massacres like Lidice in Czechoslovakia, 1942, or Srebrenica, 1995, patterns recur: targeted reprisal, public terror, silence of aftermath, eventual memory reclamation. Scholars have developed a typology of small-town massacres under occupation. The Tulle model became a case study in workshops for genocide counselors and transitional justice experts. Tulle, because its perpetrators walked away free, highlighted gaps in international justice that would later guide tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Child witnesses and their later roles. Some of the children who witnessed the hangings used their memories to shape public life. A midwife who, as a child, saw silhouettes against the church light later became mayor. Another, who sang in schools in the 1950s, is now a prominent historian. Still others carried their trauma inward and never spoke until decades later. Their personal trajectories illuminate how early trauma can steer life paths, some toward activism, some toward silence, some toward artistic expression, like painting dark, memory-laden canvases of no names but black aerial figures. Ecological scars and natural memory. For years, no flowers grew on certain slopes where the hangings took place. Local lore spoke of withering grass and trees that refused to bud out properly. Only after soil remediation in the 1990s did life return. Botanists studied these odd revenant zones, like zones of ghost memory in nature. The earth itself appeared to carry grief. Ecologists cite Tulle as an example of how human suffering sometimes leaves physiological marks on ecosystems, an eerie counterpart to stone memorials. Repatriation of families. By the 1970s, families of the 99 petitioned for reparations, not only from the German government, but also from occupying Allied forces they held responsible for failing to protect civilians. While compensation never equaled loss, several families received symbolic payments. However, many refused the money, seeing it as a poor substitute for lost lives and destroyed futures. Their choice became an ethical statement. Trust cannot be monetized. Instead, a communal fund was created to support memorial education in local schools. Modern educational programs. Now high school students in Tulle visit Berlin memorials and meet German descendants of SS troops. These educational visits involve cross-cultural dialogue, shared field trips, and joint essay contests. They explore questions like, how do you remember when the guilty were never held accountable? How do you co-create memory with former occupiers' descendants? These programs are viewed as models for global education initiatives, like Palestinian, Israeli, and Rwandan-Burundian youth partnerships. Art installations and remembrance rituals. Contemporary artists have installed public sculptures that evoke absence, a phalanx of faceless bronze silhouettes draped in ribbons, or empty swings that move in memory of the young men taken. Sound installations replay 1944 radio transmissions over evening speakers. Light sculptures throw shadow shapes against walls, linking geometry with absence. These creative interpretations are evolving Tulle's memorial landscape, enriching static stone with visceral experience. Digital Memory Archive. Since 2008, Tulle has developed a digital memory archive, oral testimonies, scanned diaries, annotated maps, and on-site augmented reality guides that let visitors experience overlaid visualizations. This is where Monsieur Becker hanged at 5:22 a.m., layered onto their phone screens as they walk the streets. These initiatives extend memory into the digital age, allowing Tulle to speak to a global audience that may never visit but can still feel the weight of those nameless corpses. Resilience in the face of revisionism. In recent years, right-wing populist movements in Europe have challenged mainstream narratives of guilt. They question occupied northern France massacres as patriotic cleaning, war propaganda, or victor's justice. Tulle's institutions responded with transparent archival evidence, public panels with historians, live-streamed ceremonies, and open debates. Their proactive stance has made them a beacon of resilience against historical revisionism. Lessons for today: civil-military relations. Tulle's story raises urgent questions about what happens when military doctrine dehumanizes civilian life. Modern occupation theory now refers to Tulle syndrome, the phenomenon of reprisals escalating under unclear chain of command control, placing local populations at extreme risk. This model is cited in UN peacekeeping doctrine to argue for civilian protection as mission critical. In turn, Tulle has been consulted as an expert body in training military chaplains on moral distress and the costs of following orders that violate civilian immunity. Toward a binational future. Looking forward, Tulle has proposed a shared Euro-region museum, co-financed by French and German funds, dedicated to the history and ethical lessons not only of WWE, but of civilian massacres post-1945, civil wars, genocides, terror attacks. The plan started in 2020 and now includes architecture students designing a path of conscience trail that runs from Tulle to Hanover. It aspires to become a monument not only to past victims, but to current global citizens committed to justice and mutual respect. The role of codebreakers and intelligence networks. In the months leading up to June 1944, French and Allied intelligence operatives achieved a critical breakthrough. They intercepted and deciphered German communication logs from Das Reich division units. These intercepts revealed not only planned movements, but also explicit willingness to commit reprisals against resistance actions. This advanced warning gave local French intelligence cells the chance to alert civilians, though many could not evacuate. While hindsight tells us more could have been done, at the time it was a delicate ethical balance between maintaining silence to protect overall resistance operations and issuing warnings that might provoke further Nazi suspicion and repression. Medical ethics under occupation. Until recently, little attention has been paid to how doctors in Tulle responded to the reprisals. Local medical staff found themselves in agonizing ethical conundrums: treat injured Wehrmacht soldiers brought by Das Reich, or secretly help survivors of the hanging. Some doctors complied under duress. Some courageously filed false medical certificates to delay German-ordered deportations of suspected resistance. A clandestine underground network of pharmacists smuggled sedatives and disinfectants to survivors, risking their licenses and their lives to alleviate trauma and infection. Espionage and underground press. Tulle's underground press flourished clandestinely even as reprisals began. Leaflets circulated, accusing the SS of war crimes, providing lists of the hanged and giving instructions on legal proceedings for survivors. A small radio whisper network transmitted updates to neighboring villages, fueling solidarity. Post-war historians uncovered that some leaflets included moral arguments from Catholic Church reforms and international law references, demonstrating that even in the darkest hours, intellectual resistance continued. Impact on contemporary labor movements. The massacres of mid-1944 also notoriously disrupted the local labor movement. Factories and workshops, now bereft of leadership and workforce, languished, but in their place emerged grassroots solidarity groups, which orchestrated sit-ins and strikes demanding post-war restoration of worker rights. Many of those gridlocked workshops eventually became hubs of the emerging post-war CGT, Confédération Générale du Travail, meaning Tulle's trauma indirectly contributed to France's leap toward labor reforms and modernization. Conflict zones and pilgrimage tourism. Decades after 1944, Tulle's sites of atrocity began attracting a specific kind of visitor: conflict zone tourists and pilgrims seeking to understand suffering globally. Emboldened by geotagged survivor testimonies and guided by AR history apps, these pilgrims travel to Tulle as part of itineraries focused on global terror zones: Rwanda, Srebrenica, and Altamira. The town found itself at the nexus of a new citizen diplomacy that used places of horror as sites of solidarity and learning, recognizing in Tulle's stones echoes of distant crises. Linguistic fractures in Tulle's memory. Language itself became a battlefield. Early memorial inscriptions were French only, but as descendants of German occupiers participated in ceremonies, plaques began including German and Occitan, a nod to Tulle's regional identity. Linguists studying memorialization note this as the Tulle trilingual shift. Memorial language gradually evolved to embrace multilingual inclusion, acknowledging that trauma documents more than local suffering. It marks languages that facilitate dialogue rather than erasure. Changing memorial aesthetics. In the 1990s, art historians observed a shift in memorial aesthetics in Tulle, where early memorials featured neoclassical stone and solemn formality. Newer additions included minimal metal sculpture, translucent materials, and time-lapse light projections. The result is a layered memorial landscape that combines archival gravitas with ephemeral art installations, capturing the evolving nature of remembering atrocity, not as a static fixation, but as a living conversation. Digital witnessing and AI restoration. Tulle has recently become part of an AI-driven digital witness project. Using machine learning trained on wartime photos and oral histories, the town is creating digital reconstructions of scenes from June 1944. Visitors can wear AR glasses that place 3D silhouettes of the hanged in their original positions along Rue Victor Hugo. While this raises profound ethical questions, psychologists have found that these digital embodiments foster deeper empathy and understanding, suggesting technology can revive silence-laden trauma for heartfelt engagement rather than sensationalism. Women sets histories and feminist ethnography. Despite the focus on male victims, feminist researchers have begun excavating the underrepresented histories of women during the reprisal period. They use oral interviews, diaries, and hidden notebooks to highlight women's contributions to rescue efforts, care networks, and post-massacre communal survival. A new feminist anthology captures how women of Tulle navigated fear, political suspicion, and motherhood with quiet courage, offering a gendered counter-narrative to the male-dominated stories of execution and militancy. Economic reclamation through culinary heritage. In a symbolic act of resilience, the town has resurrected traditional Limousin cuisine as a means of shared memory. Restaurants near the memorial serve repas de la resistance, dishes made from ingredients used during rationing, accompanied by short readings of letters from the hanged. The culinary tourism initiative, while modest, has helped resurrect portion of the local economy and invites visitors to nourish bodies and consciousness simultaneously. Comparisons with modern state accountability. Tulle has served as a reference point in recent debates about truth commissions worldwide. Its trajectory from massacre through silence, limited justice, to memorial activism is now cited in UN policy manuals on national reconciliation. Scholars argue that Tulle shows the importance of gradual accountability, not waiting for full geopolitical endorsement or trials, but building data, memory, linkage, and moral diplomacy incrementally until global norms align more fully with victim needs. Youth-led memoriality. Across Europe, Tulle's youth-led Memory Corps program addresses historical amnesia. High school students volunteer as annual guides at the museum, deliver speeches outside schools, and create TikToks that reflect personal connections to the 99 men. The result: national media coverage, student exhibits, and even murals painted by 16-year-olds on walls across the town, ensuring that the massacre remains generationally engaged rather than archived. Interfaith tragedy witnessing ceremonies. In response to rising global religious tension, Tulle has launched the Sacred Memories series, interfaith gatherings at the massacre site, involving Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and secular speakers. Each June, a different perspective is invited to offer spoken meditation, song, or poem, reinforcing that atrocity respects no faith and justice transcends communal boundaries. These ceremonies have drawn participants from Gaza, Cologne, and Sarajevo, symbolizing Tulle's evolving role in global peacebuilding. Neuroscience of collective memory. A surprising collaborative project between Tulle's Memory Center and French neuroscience researchers examines whether trauma alters local brain patterns using mobile EEG memory circuits installed in the Memorial Square. Volunteers report that being present in the town center, among the memorial markers, triggers emotional responses linked to mirror neuron activation. While preliminary, this suggests collective memory is not only transmitted through narratives, but embedded within empathetic neural networks. Corporate ethical campaign. In a controversial recent move, a tech company funded a data memory tower in Tulle, a glass obelisk storing encrypted personal messages from families of the hanged. Critics argue privatizing memory is dangerous. Proponents say it's a global time capsule project. To maintain public oversight, Tulle established a multi-stakeholder memory council with equal representation of descendants, historians, local government, and ethicists to monitor access and governance, showing an innovative model for ethical public-private history collaboration. Global networks of memorial sites. Tulle's story has rippled into global sites of conscience networks, linking places like the Apartheid Museum, the Kigali Genocide Memorial, and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. These networks engage in cross-training, traveling exhibitions, and joint youth programs. Tulle hosted a global forum in 2018 on rituals of acknowledgement, bringing together survivors from 5 continents, afar from conclusions, but forging paths toward global solidarity and ethical memory sharing. Climate, conflict, and memory. In planning for climate resilience, Tulle's municipality noted that extreme heat or flood events could threaten memorial sites. Rather than see this as a technical problem, local historians argued climate disasters are extensions of war, layers of vulnerability that echo wartime precarity. Consequently, the town now includes memorial sites within green infrastructure planning, ensuring future generations can remember, uninterrupted by climate change. The role of civilian documentation in preserving truth. While much of the post-war record relies on military or judicial archives, it was the civilians of Tulle, particularly local photographers, priests, and teachers, who ensured that the earliest visual and written testimonies were preserved. With cameras smuggled from neighboring towns, photos were taken in secret of the town square in the aftermath of the massacre. These images, along with handwritten journals by parish leaders and school officials, served as a primary record in the first years of post-liberation confusion. Without their work, much of the early horror could have been lost in rumor, distortion, or bureaucratic omission. The impact on religious institutions and clergy. Churches in Tulle bore not just witness to the massacre, but became involuntary sites of triage and grief management. The local clergy, many of whom had quietly supported the resistance or hid Jews in cellars, were suddenly faced with lines of families demanding sacraments, last rites, or spiritual explanation. In the aftermath, churches held daily masses for the dead for over a year. But the massacre also created tension within the church hierarchy. While local priests preached compassion and resistance, some higher clergy seeking to maintain institutional neutrality discouraged overt political involvement. This divide left lingering fractures in post-war ecclesiastical leadership across the region. The erosion of trust in local governance. Following the massacre, one of the most severe consequences for Tulle's civil society was the total erosion of trust in local governance. Some town officials were accused of collaborating or failing to warn resistance fighters. In a few cases, former Vichy appointees tried to flee with forged documents but were caught by angry mobs. Post-war elections became tense battlegrounds between rival political factions: communists who led many resistance cells, Gaullists who sought national unity, and centrists who tried to maintain institutional continuity. The town's political realignment in the following decade reflected these tensions, with anti-authoritarian sentiments becoming entrenched in civic life for generations. Resistance women and their hidden legacy. The story of Tulle's women, particularly those who participated in or supported resistance efforts, has often been overshadowed by male martyrdom. Yet dozens of women played essential roles as couriers, medical assistants, signal operators, or intelligence gatherers. After the massacre, many of these women were responsible for hiding survivors, burying the dead, and delivering critical information to neighboring resistance groups. They also formed the backbone of community healing, organizing memorials, advocating for orphans, and petitioning for reparations. Only recently have local archives begun highlighting their names and stories, correcting a long-standing gap in public memory. The psychological language of occupation. One underexplored dimension of the Tulle massacre is the linguistic effect occupation had on daily life. During Nazi control, French citizens in Tulle were forced to adopt new euphemisms: suspension instead of hanging, cleansing instead of reprisal, sanction instead of murder. These terms, repeated in public broadcasts and local decrees, blurred the line between action and atrocity. The Nazi lexicon was designed to normalize cruelty and frame violence as order. In post-war years, the conscious rejection of these terms became part of Tulle's cultural rehabilitation, with community writers and educators explicitly redefining these words in schools and public debates as part of a moral reorientation. Rural resistance and urban sacrifice. While the massacre occurred in Tulle, many of the resistance fighters involved in the preceding attack hailed from nearby rural areas. These fighters operated from the forests and hills, launching sabotage missions against rail lines, convoys, and communication posts. When the German SS retaliated, they targeted the urban civilian population who had not participated in the attack. This disparity created an uncomfortable debate in the aftermath. Should rural resistance fighters have anticipated the retaliation? Was the city unfairly sacrificed? While most civilians supported the resistance goals, the psychological split between the countryside as operational zone and the city as punishment ground left lasting resentment that wasn't fully addressed until decades later in reconciliation ceremonies. The unofficial underground escape network. In the days immediately following the massacre, a quiet but intense operation began among surviving resistance members to smuggle out key figures and families marked for arrest. Using old wine cellars, mountain trails, and backroad routes, dozens of people were ferried out of Tulle to safe zones. This underground escape network eventually merged with national exfiltration operations and contributed to rescuing many Jewish families hiding under false identities. One little-known story involves a Catholic convent that disguised a wounded resistance fighter as a nun, moving him through a chain of cloisters until he reached Free French forces in the south. These daring rescues are only now being documented through oral history projects. Economic rebuilding and the labor of grief. Economically, Tulle suffered a near collapse after the massacre. The loss of 99 men, many of whom were young fathers and workers, stripped entire industries of their skilled labor base. The local textile mills, already weakened by wartime disruption, folded within a year. Reconstruction funds were slow to arrive, and the region became dependent on subsistence agriculture and black market trading for survival. But this economic ruin had a deeper effect. It linked material scarcity with grief. Widows had to work jobs their husbands once held, children had to drop out of school, and trades once passed from father to son were interrupted. Tulle's economy became a reflection of its broken social body, taking decades to heal. International journalistic response and censorship. When word of the massacre reached Allied news desks, the initial response was muffled. Censorship by military press units, concerned about undermining morale or provoking premature retaliation, downplayed civilian reprisals. Only a handful of British and American journalists managed to file detailed accounts, often smuggled through unofficial channels. When photos of the hangings finally emerged, they were met with shock, but also skepticism. In some American newspapers, readers accused the reports of being propaganda. It wasn't until the Nuremberg trials that the full horror of Tulle was acknowledged as verified historical fact, and even then, its place in the broader narrative of Nazi atrocities remained underemphasized. The politics of apology. Decades after the war, attempts were made to address the legacy of Tulle through official apology. In the 1990s, representatives from Germany visited Tulle and laid wreaths in public ceremonies. A formal statement of remorse was read aloud by a federal minister, acknowledging the responsibility of the German state for the crimes committed by the SS. While many townspeople welcomed the gesture, some viewed it as too little, too late. Local survivors insisted that true justice would have required extradition and prosecution of remaining perpetrators. The political debate over what constitutes meaningful apology continues to influence French-German diplomatic culture to this day. Cultural reinterpretation through film and literature. In the last 20 years, the massacre has become a subject of dramatic interpretation. Several French filmmakers have produced works blending fictional narrative with historical accuracy, focusing on individuals caught between resistance and reprisal. Meanwhile, novelists have used the massacre as a backdrop for broader meditations on memory, loss, and the ethics of vengeance. These cultural artifacts have introduced younger audiences to the events in ways that textbooks and documentaries cannot. They've also stirred debate about artistic responsibility, how much can be fictionalized without distorting truth, and whether dramatization serves remembrance or exploits it. Lessons for civil-military ethics in occupied territories. Finally, the Tulle massacre remains a case study in civil-military relations under occupation. Military academies in France and across NATO now teach Tulle as a scenario exercise. Cadets study the failure of command responsibility, the abuse of collective punishment, and the consequences of detaching military force from legal and ethical constraints. These case studies ask future officers to confront the moral dimensions of command, occupation, and retaliation, lessons tragically learned in the shadowed squares of a small French town that bore witness to a moment of immense inhumanity.